So, as you've heard, my name's Felicity Evans. I'm the lead user interface developer at Fairfax Media. Now, just to give you kind of a little bit of overview of who I am, in my role I predominantly wear two hats. The first hat looks a little bit like this. It's my site manager hat. So if you've ever been kind of past a construction site and seen like 4 or 5 people standing around and one person doing the work, and wondered what's happening, it's called oversight, and I do a lot of it. The second hat I wear looks a little bit like this. It's my developer cap. And so to borrow from the construction analogy, it means that I'm not always the one standing around pointing. Occasionally I'm in the hole holding the shovel. And the third and final thing you need to know about me is that I am a relatively new dog owner, and this is my beautiful bulldog called Lola. I'm perhaps slightly obsessive about her, so sorry co-workers who are here tonight. If you remember nothing from my talk tonight except to follow her, Miss Lola the Bulldog, on Instagram, she and my husband who runs the account will be eternally grateful, but don't go there now because I'll lose you entirely. Okay, so back to the topic at hand, a Sass manifesto. So it sounds a little bit heavy-handed. What exactly is it that I'm on about? Well, what I hope to do today is to set up some guiding principles that we can follow when we write our Sass, although many of these principles are equally applicable to other forms of development, less and others. So, before I begin, a warning. I'm speaking in the terms of a manifesto, so I'm intentionally making quite strong statements, but I want you to have this at the forefront of your mind. Strong opinions weakly held. For those of you who aren't familiar with this expression, it's basically a way of saying express your ideas with conviction, but be willing to drop them and adopt better ideas as they make themselves available. So everything in software is really new and so frequently being reinvented that it's kind of amateurs like me who make the progress. So don't be afraid to make progress, but be humble enough to be able to change your opinions and your views when people present you with the alternative. So hands up here who is using Sass or Sassy CSS in your day-to-day work. Cool, it's good to see. So for those of you who aren't or are just beginning to use it, I think at first you need to be clear why it is you're using Sass and what the benefits are, because at the end of the day it just outputs vanilla CSS. So if you're going to make a significant change to your processes, then you need to be clear what the benefits are and what you're going to gain from it. So I'm summarising these within my team as kind of 4 main benefits or reasons that we switched to Sass. Come chat to me afterwards if you can come up with some more. So, firstly, Sass simplifies repetitive tasks. There are heaps and heaps of examples of how it does this, but one kind of clear way is the way that it makes it easier to write cross-browser CSS3 mixins. So, quick example for us. Here on the left, we've got the Sass, so using Sass and a library called Compass that I'll talk to later. We've got a button. We're using this mixin, which is the include there. We're specifying border radius, and on the right-hand side, we've got the vendor prefixes, and what you'll see is you don't have the whole array of them. So one of the good things about using a preprocessor like Sass is that if you are updating the versions, you won't get the whole pile that you used to have. You'll actually get a kind of smaller stack. So the second reason that we use Sass, or the benefit from using Sass, is that it creates consistency. So have you ever found yourself getting a PSD from a designer, trying to work out what the colours are and kind of using the eyedropper tool and going and picking a colour and picking another one and writing them down, and I've got 5 different greys and 3 of them look really similar. So Sass is a great way of being able to use variables so that you're not declaring multiple versions of a really similar colour in this instance. You can also use mix-ins like lighten and darken, a whole lot of it, so that you can create shades and tones of that colour. And you can codify your measurements on the site so that you get consistent measurements, gutters and that sort of thing. And the sort of offshoot of that is that if you start doing that, you've kind of got yourself a style guide built in. So thirdly, it improves maintainability. Again, a scenario. If you work on a large team or with legacy code, you've probably found yourself in the position where you've just kind of had a long CSS file and you've just added something at the bottom and you've upped the specificity, you've kind of crossed your fingers and just hoped that it doesn't break anything on the site. So if it were possible, Sass allows you to sort of flatten out that cascade. You can begin to understand the scope of the impacts that you make. Because you can break things up into partials and you can use variables, you can have multiple people working on one file much more easily and are much less likely to have conflicts when that happens. And finally, it allows reuse. So because of things like mix-ins, variables, extends and other Sass goodness, you can codify patterns and you don't find yourself writing the same lines of CSS over and over. So, Sass is good. But what is good is not always good for us. Okay, so this is where the Sass manifesto comes in. It is for our good. So I'm going to present these as 6 articles. So article number 1, output over input. The quality and integrity of the generated CSS is of greater importance than the pre-compiled code. So again, hands up if when writing Sass or SCSS, you regularly check on the outputted CSS. Oh, fewer people hesitant. I'm probably a hesitant hand up there. I know I should. So when Sass first came on the scene, it had lots of detractors and people said some nasty things about it. And one of the main reasons for this is that people were using Sass to output some pretty horrific CSS. So the ease with which you could happily nest selectors and our kind of desire to do this, to line everything up so neatly, meant that we were nesting everything really deeply, but not looking at what the CSS that was coming out the other end. So we had overly specific selectors, which had implications for rendering performance, file size, and maintainability, because we're effectively kind of mimicking the DOM in the CSS structure. So if the markup changed, then our CSS didn't work and the site broke. So as a sort of a way of guarding against this, be careful when using nested and mix-ins that you're not outputting unnecessary code, and consider using the techniques, or do use the techniques of object-oriented principles together with some things we'll talk about like placeholder selectors and extends to create shallower CSS. Just because you're using Sass and you can nest doesn't mean you should. Article number 2, proximity over abstraction. CSS classes, selectors and properties should be understood in their context without relying on external dependencies to decode their meaning. So we've got a map here, we've got a key. The value of the key is that it's located next to the map and you can decode one with the other. As you know, Sass is built on Ruby. And as well as using the core Sass gem, you can also add a lot of other gems that help you with an array of tasks. So generating grids, using frameworks, resets, etc. However, despite the promises that these offer, I would be really, I'm not going to say don't use them, but really wary of using libraries, with the exception of Compass, because that's maintained alongside Sass, and maybe even then you need to have a good reason. So the reason being that the more of these you use, the less contained your Sass files are, and the less portable your project is. If somebody is wanting to use your project, they have to have those same dependencies, and those dependencies are stored outside of the project itself. So it becomes really hard to maintain, and with Sass you can get some really bad errors that are kind of hard to work out what's happened if you've got like a version conflict with a gem. Article number 3, understanding over brevity. So where possible, the purpose and intention of classes and functions should be easily understood from their name, and where necessary, use comments to make meaning transparent. So acronyms can be confusing. Please don't use them in your CSS class names. Sass already outputs for you super compressed files if you want it to. So there's no need to get really heavy-handed in your optimization of the precompiled code. Use comments liberally. You can use the double slash comments. They don't come into your output. So use them to explain what it is you're doing. If you've got a mix-in, explain what the output of that mix-in will be. Incidentally, this is also the reason for my preference of the SCSS syntax over the Sass syntax. The Sass syntax being the white space syntax that kind of came out when Sass was first introduced, and then the SCSS syntax mimicking the CSS styles with the parentheses, etc. I want everyone in my team to be able to write Sass, and the barrier to entry with the white space is just too great for them and for me as well. Article number 4, semantics, I've got function here over presentation. So class names should convey meaning. Use placeholder selectors to include visual styles across semantic elements. So people may disagree with me here, and I love object-oriented CSS, but one thing that never sat well with me in the world of object-oriented CSS was the use of presentational class names, and in particular chaining of multiple presentational class names in order to achieve a particular look. So kind of, some people were quite happy to whack in a sort of margin right 10 class or something, and I just felt a little bit dirty using those. So I love that in this instance Sass will let me have my cake and eat it too. So there's this thing which I'm going to show in a sec called a placeholder or a silent selector, which allows you to declare a style without outputting it to the page until it's called. So what this means is that you can have style names that are presentational because it's doing a presentational thing that's not going to output to your CSS until it's called. So let me give you an example here. So we've got, this is what a placeholder selector looks like. It's got the percentage sign. It's doing something that is quite presentational, so it's centering an object. We're extending that inside the container and the image class. On the right hand side you can see that we don't have that center class, and if we didn't call that center class we wouldn't actually get any of that any of this stuff on the left hand side output to the CSS. It's only output when you call the class. So if you have a style that's persistent, that is very visual, you can still create a class here in your Sass which describes what it's doing, but not relying on that in the CSS that's outputting, because the CSS has to match the class names, and your style, which might be center, somebody could go around and say, well, I actually want to align everything left, and if you've got a .center class, then you've got some confusion. Article number 5, consistency over novelty. As multiple Sass files can be combined into one CSS, avoid aesthetic code changes or updates to libraries which could cause versioning conflicts. So here we have the Champs-Élysées in Paris. There are no golden arches, there are only white neon arches, because the rest of the Champs-Élysées is neon and it fits in, and whoever thought that McDonald's could be beautiful. So there's a real temptation when you first encounter Sass to kind of Sassify everything. And this can be a real problem, especially with legacy code. So the scenario where you want to change one thing, like the colour of an element, but you get in there to the code and you decide to clean it up, and so you make everything Sass. The developer that's got to pick up that code at the end of the day can't see the change, because the two CSS files, even though you've only changed one thing in what's displayed on screen, look completely different from each other. So there's a time and a place for refactoring, which is always and constantly, but with legacy code, be careful when you do it gradually. Separate your commit. So if you are changing something visually, use that in one commit, and then if you're refactoring, do that in another commit. If you're touching legacy code, if you're touching certain parts of the code, separate those out into partials in Sass and make the changes there, and then leave the rest and only change that as you touch it. If you've got multiple people who down the line who've then got to pick up the CSS that you're outputting. Article number 6, we're almost there. Okay, consolidation over repetition. So make your code dry, recognise and codify repeating patterns. Before you start any project, you've probably heard that it's sensible to sit down and try to identify all the modules that are in the design, and I completely agree with that. However, if you're like me, some of the patterns won't become apparent until you've kind of written the same or a really similar line of CSS over and over again. So as soon as that happens, you can start to codify them in your Sass. So write mix-ins where the pattern takes a variable. Use placeholder selectors for repeating visual styles, and add variables for recurring values. So there you have it, a Sass manifesto. Output over input, proximity over abstraction, understanding over brevity, function over presentation, consistency over novelty, consolidation over repetition. So I'm aware that some of these objectives, once you start to get into writing your Sass, may conflict with each other. They've been presented as articles 1 through 6, but not in priority order. You'll have to, when you get in the code, you'll have to work out, what do I value in this instance more? And, you know, that's not going to be easy. It might be difficult, but a lesson from my dog Lola, which is, just because something is difficult doesn't mean it can't also be fun. So this is her trying to play football with a cone on her head. She's doing a noble job. So, hang on, I have to find my mouse. Back we go. So, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't also say, we're hiring. Sorry. So, UI dev positions, UX architects, designers, more, go to the Stack Overflow page or chat to me, and I promise I will leave now. Thank you.